Well, good morning, everyone. Really pleased to have been invited to speak to you today. I'm always away this time of year, so it's the first time I've ever got to Abergavenny at this particular point in time, so I've always missed the festival in the past, but fortunately here today, so very pleased to be. I'm going to talk about some of the negatives that we experience around the issue of food in society initially, and then I'm going to go on to use just heard mention of the deep play study at Tredegar, which I will say a little bit more about, to actually envisage a different future, one in which food plays an absolutely critical role in the recovery of some of our most disadvantaged and deprived communities in South Wales. So let's take a look at some of the negatives. It's a depressing list, and I think it's symptomatic of something much larger, which I will come to at the end of this slide. Food adulteration. Much of what we eat has a range of things added to it that, in theory, improve the quality. This isn't new. First example I've ever come across was Karl Marx writing about white bread, to which they added chalk. In the 1850s to make it whiter, because white bread was actually ate by the rich then. The poor ate wholemeal bread. Strange reversal. So food adulteration, and Marx is very clear why it's done. It's for profit. We add things to food to make more money. The list today of what we put in our food is quite substantial. Trans fats, added sugars, bulking agents, colour, preservatives, all to increase shelf life, to increase customer attraction, appearance, taste in theory. And that has a very significant effect. I've got a dietary condition, which means I have to read the label of everything I eat. And I am astonished sometimes as to the contents of quite simple foodstuffs, which I frequently put back on the shelf, although I could in theory eat them, because I'm not willing to put in the chemical cocktail, basically, that they often contain. So that's a very serious problem, and it has major health consequences. For example, preservatives in prepared meats, which have a very clear link to high incidences of bowel cancer. It's a very simple mechanism. Food contamination, I won't dwell on this too much. We've had numerous examples over the years, salmonella in eggs, and of course the horse meat scandal of recent years. That's a mere symptom of something much bigger, and it is the way we now produce food and the extended length of supply chains, a theme I will keep returning to. The longer the supply chain, the more risk there is of people abusing that product and entering into nefarious activities for greater profit, but also now evidence that even criminal gangs are moving into the contamination of food. I remember a scandal that Tesco managed to keep very carefully squashed. I was buying chicken in Tesco's about 10 years ago, and it was going off the day after I bought it. And I kept taking it back, and they kept telling me my fridge was too cold. It was subsequently revealed that Tesco's and a number of supermarkets, in fact, had condemned meat in their supply chain, and the company was washing it in salt and packaging it with the required sell-by dates. That's a good example of the way that criminal activity can enter the food chain. Food miles, again, I won't dwell too much on this. I think we're all aware of the implications of non-seasonal foods, etc. Spring onions from Kenya. We all look at the label perhaps and hopefully put them back. But it's more serious than that. Even the general distribution of food. We've had silly examples. Potatoes produced in Pembrokeshire been taken to Tesco's distribution centre at Chepstow to be shipped back into Wales for distribution to their stores. The system is crazy and in urgent need of reform. Food insecurity, often we think of this as an international problem, when wheat harvests fail, price goes up, poorer countries can't afford imports, etc. But I think increasingly it's a question for all of us, as we are now almost wholly reliable on imported foodstuffs. We do not have an indigenous food industry that could sustain us in the event of a collapse in international transport, for example. which, if we listen to some of the transition theorists, is inevitable. We will not be flying food around the globe in 20 years' time. The cost will be far too great. It won't happen. So we all face potential food insecurity in the future. Food poverty, I think seen as a relatively new phenomenon, the rise of food banks, indicative of much deeper levels of poverty in society than just merely the inability to buy food. This is about a fundamental inequality that's arisen in the UK over the last 30 years to reach proportions where in Wales now we have a child poverty rate of 31%. That's a third of our children almost living in daily poverty. That is a national scandal. I say this every time I speak, and I hope that at some point that message will be taken very seriously by Welsh Government and acted on perhaps more fundamentally than currently. Recently there's also been a lot of focus on the high street and the role of food in the high street. A kind of a distortion exists at the moment. Frequently, Portis identified this in her study, the fast food outlets. But we'll see in a moment when we come to the positives, food can also be a way of diversifying the high street. So there's a bit of a kind of a duality we need to take on board here. All this adds up to, I think, quite a fundamental thing. Food for me is emblematic of neoliberal economics. We haven't got this food system by accident. It exists because neoliberal economics has particular features to it. It, for example, likes to outsource. It likes to extend supply chains. It likes to take production out of the local economy and put it in the hands of multinationals. Neoliberalism as an economic model has given us the food system that we currently have. This is not an accident. This isn't the way that food has to be produced, marketed and consumed. It is the product of an economic system that has brought us a particular approach to food. My more positive thoughts, I will come to how we can challenge that and actually use food as a mechanism for renewal. The seriousness, I think, of that implication is that as long as we have governments that are absolutely welded to the neoliberal approach, we will have this food system. This is why the government does not take on the food companies on sugar content, for example, and fat content. It's because the neoliberal model is dominant. It's absolutely fundamental to the way governments see the economy as constantly achieving growth. And there is now a growing international movement for low growth, no growth, post-growth. There's all sorts of labels to it. That growth isn't necessarily the only economic model. And if we do have growth, can it be growth for social benefit rather than private profit? Okay. Sarah mentioned that I worked until recently at the Centre for Regeneration Excellence Wales. There we were concerned to look at all aspects of regeneration. Food figures quite significantly in that. Huge potential in regenerating communities through food and the development of new food systems. Markets, everyone loves a market. Porter celebrated them. They're seen as a transformative activity for particularly the old market towns. We work very closely with Action for Market Towns, now called Towns Alive, and they see a clear role for economic renewal through the development of markets. Farmers' markets particularly, I think, have revealed a particular opportunity because of their portability. They're not fixed to, say, an indoor market like the now famous Swansea market. They can roam around and bring benefits to multiple locations. And the farmers' market in Cardiff at Riverside has been very successful, and I'm sure some of you have been there. We have food destinations. I think we have someone from Ludlow on the agenda for today. Ludlow's established itself as a food destination, as indeed Abergavenny has now. And this has been seen as a way of bringing footfall, visitors, numbers, etc. to certain locations. Not everyone can do it, just in the way that not everyone can have a book festival like Hay. Not everyone can have a food festival, not everyone can have 5 Michelin star restaurants. But it's a mechanism for some towns. Potentially a mechanism for high street diversification, the rise of the coffee shop. Has been an astonishing change in British culture over the last 10 years. Even, though we see the domination of that by the international chains, there's also a lot of independent companies out there in our smaller towns, providing evidence that people want quality on the high street. We've seen the rise of the butcher again in many of our towns, the baker. It's the way food is actually taken in some ways the empty premises in the high streets and converted them to old purposes, bringing that kind of diversification. Horrible term, prosumer initiatives. People both producing and consuming food. Famous examples, Todmorden, Stroud, the kind of local initiatives, getting people to grow collectively, hopefully, and sharing that food in that way. Regrettably, the evidence is that these only succeed with our relatively affluent food markets, either in the, where the food project exists or in close proximity to them. Very few examples of this happening to any great extent in more deprived communities. What tends to happen there are the development of food cooperatives. Welsh Government has been sponsoring food cooperatives for about the last 5 years. I've been involved in a couple of them through the Communities First programme. Highly successful, but limited in their impact, largely to do with veg boxes, etc. I'm old enough to remember shopping in the co-op as a young boy, where you had your own currency, you were given tokens for milk and bread, and the cooperative was the core consumption pattern across the South Wales valleys in the 1950s and 60s. And finally, I think there's some good examples of what I would call social inclusion activities, working with deprived communities through food growing schemes, allotment schemes, to bring people out of long-term economic inactivity, social exclusion, withdrawal, disengagement, bringing them into communal activities, often the first step in a passage to long-term employment. And we have a number of good examples in Wales and ample throughout the UK. So that's food and regeneration, and all power to those activities. Let's hope they flourish and develop over the next 10, 15 years. But I want to propose something more radical. I want to suggest that food provides us an opportunity to be transformative, to actually to change the patterns of economy and production in some of our most disadvantaged communities. And here is where I will refer to the deep play study of Tredegar. It was a study conducted by Crew over a period of 1 year. We took one place, measurable in size, understandable in context, to try and argue that we need to do things very differently if we want to achieve economic and social sustainability by 2030. We were influenced by transition theory, by total place models of public service, and something I'm going to come to in a moment, theories of the foundational economy that have been developed at Manchester Business School. And we applied it to one place. We asked, what could we do to this place to both eradicate poverty and achieve low-carbon sustainability? And we developed a number of ideas with groups of experts drawn from transport, housing, health, education, and members of the local community, trying to create a new vision for almost an alternative economic model. And food figured very significantly in it. We felt there were 4 areas of economic activity that could produce huge benefits. The first was energy conservation and energy production. Following the German system, the Energiewende system, community renewable energies, massive programs of energy conservation in homes and public buildings, and the creation of jobs to achieve that. We looked at the care sector. We have a horrendous care sector in the UK where most of it is outsourced to international companies with no community buy-in and no community voice. We looked at employment through the internet, through distant marketing methods, e-commerce, and the potential there. We also looked at food. And this brings us to, I think, the way food can create social transformation. I mentioned the term a little earlier, foundational economy. It's not a complicated concept. It is the idea that around about 30% of us work in the section of the economy that delivers the mundane things that we need every day. And the term mundane is used very deliberately. We need food, we need energy, we need housing, we need healthcare, we need education, we need transport, we need telecommunications. These are fundamental, foundational aspects of economic activity. Governments largely just allow them to happen. They're off busy sponsoring pharmaceuticals, aerospace, weapons, large-scale infrastructure projects. The foundational economy is largely left to its own devices. Professor Carol Williams at Manchester Business School says, let's develop it. Currently employs 30% of people. Why can't we make that 50%? Why can't we really make this aspect of the economy work for us? And he looks at food in particular. And the one model that he looks at is the bacon production in the UK. As little as 10 years ago, the UK was 50%. Sorry, as little as 10 years ago, it was 80% self-sufficient in bacon production. We're now down to 50%. We import most of our bacon from Denmark and Holland, two of the highest wage economies in the world. An absurd system of transport and production. He suggests we could shorten those supply chains to bring that production back to the UK. And it's that notion of extended supply chains he looks at particularly. Why is most of the food we consume produced on an intercontinental basis rather than a local basis? And once you ask that fundamental question, you begin to see some solutions emerging. He talks about remodeling the food supply, actually looking at how we can relocalize it, bring food production back within the local economy. He looks particularly at the role of anchor institutions, hospitals, schools, universities, churches, civic societies. Where do we consume? Where do we buy the stuff we want? He thinks hospitals have a key role to play here. I'm very pleased that Welsh Government has recently recognised that and seems now to be thinking of its hospitals as anchor institutions in the local economy. The example we looked at was from Oregon in the United States, the green growers, where they've employed people from very marginalised communities to produce food for 3 local universities and 2 hospitals. Struggled initially, but now vibrant and employing a significant number of people. We're not talking allotments. We are talking large-scale commercial food production, bringing the latest technologies to bear to the production of food. Crew has been working with New York State University for some time on a system which would enable large-scale industrial greenhouses to be built and heated for free using products from willow and native fibre stock. An incredible opportunity which we're still trying to convince Welsh Government could happen. So we're not talking about small local initiatives, we're talking about meeting the needs of the whole population from a more localised model of food supply. Actually making it work in terms of employment, in terms of price, in terms of supply. And that food sector has a massive potential for employment. Think about relocalising much of the production, and the potential for employment in the local economy becomes enormous. And that leads to both poverty eradication and hopefully environmental sustainability. The project in New York is hoping to grow salad crops for the New York restaurant market in the immediate upstate area of New York, taking out of the equation transport of salad stuffs from as far away as California. The environmental impact of that is enormous. If you want to look at the Deep Play study in detail, that's the web address. There's a link there on the home page, and it's available for free. We urge people to read the full report rather than the executive summary, because there's a lot of detail in there. But there are some blockages in the way. There are vested interests that make the achievement of some of these ideals very, very difficult. We recognise in the report that food is the greatest challenge we have identified in this transformational approach. Globalisation of production is one of those enemies. We have a system now that produces food intercontinentally. We import food from almost everywhere in the globe. There are huge and powerful economic interests involved in that trade. And persuading them that there's an alternative model might be slightly difficult. Governments are welded to that model. I mentioned governments' inability or unwillingness to take on the food industry for health gain. One of the alarming things we discovered in Tredegar was that if you live in Tredegar, your well life expectancy is 20 years less than if you live in Abergavenny. You know, that is an incredible statistic. That's not life expectancy, that's your well life expectancy. The amount of time you will live before you experience a long-term life-limiting illness. That's a 20-year gap. That's the greatest inequality I can think of. And governments don't seem willing to tackle that. Food plays a huge role in the creation of that gap. Everybody hates the supermarkets. We all hate them. We all go there. You know, it's that great paradox. It has become the norm. It is the standard method of distribution of food. We all, you know, play a little around the edges of it, but basically most of us still use the supermarket. And that comes to the greatest vested interest of all, us, the consumer. En masse, there may be individuals in this room who have completely sorted their food supply and do it ethically, morally, and sustainably. I've failed categorically to do that in its entirety, and I suspect most of us, if we're honest, have. It is a huge challenge. One of the key things is that we need food, we need it to be cheap, we need it to be available. And we have grown to expect and accept a supply of food which is never-ending in its variety, in its freshness, in its price. It works for everybody. And to propose a change to that system is to take on the greatest vested interest of all, you and me. Okay, I'll leave it at that.